Welcome to week 4 of youth ministry. Um, Hopefully, you are keeping up with the reading and especially with iGen. If you haven't looked at the syllabus lately, the review paper for iGen is due at the end of this week. So, if you haven't, hopefully, you've at least started that book. It doesn't need to be like a real thorough heavy read. You need to read it lightly enough that you know what she's talking about and that you can sort of critically interact with it. But that's coming up quickly, and that's worth a good chunk of your grade. So please do make sure you get that done. You can just email it to me. Um, that'd be the easiest way to get it to me. Just email it to me, and that is due. It's due by the end of Saturday. I will take it late. Late is better than not at all. You'll lose some points for that, but the important thing is to make sure you get it done. We are now done with Almost Christian. So we moved out of that book now, and we're in the textbook that is going to carry us through the end of the course, Starting Right, which is edited by Kenda Creasy-Dean, but includes essays by a lot of different people. And so we're going to bite off a good chunk of that each week. So this week was 5 chapters. None of them are particularly long chapters, but it's a good chunk of reading. And again, I said that at the outset of this course, it would have a lot of reading because it's entirely online. We're not meeting in person, and so because there are no tests or quizzes, that means that the majority of your class time is reading. So this week, 5 chapters. This first section kind of dealing on the big picture of youth ministry. It deals a lot with youth culture and sort of the science behind it, the sociological elements, psychological elements, but with a theological twist. And so the first chapter, which is a very important chapter, I almost decided to make our discussion question from the first chapter. There was some really good stuff here, but I ended up going with chapter 4 for that. So, but the first chapter deals with some theological issues. Those who have taken classes with me, particularly hermeneutics, which I know Matt took with me, is familiar with the idea of embedded theology. She talks about this in this chapter. She talks about 3 different types of theology. First, there's what she calls intuitive theology. And intuitive theology is sort of instinctive. It's not taught. It's not picked up from anywhere. It's just what we kind of naturally, our assumptions about God or about the supernatural or about morality. It comes entirely from within us. So it's intuitive. It's not acquired. This is what you'd see among people who maybe have no religious background at all, but they still have some opinions. Right? They weren't raised in a church. Their parents weren't religious. They had no instruction, but they formulated their own views. So intuitive theology is sort of our basic instinctual theology. Similar to that, but a little bit deeper, is what we call embedded theology. And I talk about embedded theology a lot. Embedded theology, if you were raised in the church, raised in a Christian family, if you had some sort of Christian or any kind of religious instruction, even if it's fairly informal, what you have is not intuitive theology, it is embedded theology. Intuitive theology would come from no one but you. Embedded theology is absorbed theology. It's environmental. I guess it assimilates with your intuitive theology, but it becomes embedded because it comes from somewhere else and you absorb it. Embedded theology is what you've picked up. It's not been reflected upon. It's an inherited faith. It's an inherited theology. So for most teenagers, that's going to be, well, what do their parents believe? If they grew up in the church, what does their church teach? And usually it's going to be some configuration of those two. And that's not to say, if you grow up in a church and, today we're a very post-denominational society. So you may have people who belong to a church and they don't necessarily believe all of its theology. You may have someone who goes to a Presbyterian church, but guess what? They don't believe in predestination. They're not a Calvinist, but they go to a Presbyterian church. Then your embedded theology, it may not necessarily match what your church believes. If your parents are countering aspects of your church's theology, which was true for me growing up. I didn't believe everything my church believed because my parents didn't. But it may also be what your church teaches. But that's the idea. It's embedded, but it's what you're raised with. But it's not been critically reflected upon. It's assumed. This is what I've been taught. This is how I've been raised. This is what I believe. What she describes as a crisis of faith, and I almost decided to do our discussion question on this because this is an important thing. A crisis of faith is what happens when our intuitive or especially our embedded theology comes under attack. When it is subjected to critical scrutiny. And that doesn't necessarily mean that someone is actually out there actively attacking it. It could be we go through a personal crisis. Someone dies, someone gets sick, we get sick, we witness some sort of injustice, but something happens that throws a wrench into our theology, and it causes us to question it. That's a crisis of faith. It is what happens with embedded and intuitive theology, because those are types of faith that have not been questioned. They've always been assumed. Particularly in the case of embedded theology, it was just handed to you and you accepted it, no questions asked. This crisis of faith commonly occurs in college. This is what your youth pastor warned you about. You go off to college, and they're going to try to destroy your faith. Now, as a college professor myself, sometimes that happens. There are professors out there who make it their mission to rewrite your philosophy, to rewrite your epistemology, and sometimes they do have an agenda. I will say that in my experience, that is not generally the case. Most of the time, a crisis of faith is not because someone is actively trying to destroy our faith, but they are posing difficult questions, and for good reasons. Because maybe the truth is most of our embedded theologies are wrong. Most of our intuitive theologies are wrong. Unless you are the lucky one who was raised to believe all the exact right things, odds are your theology is not perfect. And so all they are trying to do is get you to think more critically, get you to think more deeply. They're trying to correct things that might be wrong, but the result is still a crisis of faith. And certainly I have probably instigated crises of faith in people. Now, I think I do a pretty good job of cleaning up my messes and helping people to not destroy their faith because of it, but sometimes we need a crisis of faith because that's the only way we're going to grow. And that leads to the third type of theology that comes up in this chapter, which is called deliberate theology. Deliberate theology is theology that has been questioned and is still being questioned. It's examined faith, or what Anselm of Canterbury calls faith-seeking understanding. It's not a lack of faith. It's not just not believing anything, but it's holding those beliefs with a certain looseness, a certain tentativeness, being aware that our theology is not perfect. We can always improve it. We can always refine it. And so it's willing to examine and adjust faith when necessary. But it's actually, what might seem to some people to be a weak, wishy-washy faith, but it's actually not. It's actually a very strong faith because it's strong enough that it's not afraid to ask questions. It is willing to ask why we believe things, why we do things, and it's willing to express doubt, but it does so in confidence that God's not threatened. Or what I always tell students who maybe are struggling with having their embedded theology questioned is, and they feel like, well, I've always been told I can't ask these questions. I can't question anything. What I always say to them is, you really think God is threatened by your questions? You really think you're going to stump God? You're going to ask a question that God can't answer? And so that's the way I approach, is particularly teaching the Bible. Um, is say, hey, ask the toughest questions you can. Pick this text apart. Critique it. Because at the end of the day, I believe that God can handle it, and God's word can handle it. We don't need to back off, because, and I think the ramifications of not being allowed to question faith are pretty awful, because over time and particularly when people get into college, they come to the conclusion that if we can't question something, that means because it can't stand up to questioning. If the Bible is so frail and so sensitive, and if God is so frail and sensitive that we can't express doubt and we can't question, then it must not be very strong. And I've had so many students who have come to me and taken my classes and said, I walked away from the faith. I dropped out of church because I was never allowed to question anything, so I decided it must all be fake. No one can ever answer my questions. And my class was usually a good experience for them, because it was the first time they were actually allowed to and even encouraged to ask those tough questions. And rather than scaring them off, it actually usually won them back. I can't tell you how many people I've had who came back to the church because of being allowed to more freedom in how they would think about theology and how they would read the Bible. So, in Dean's opinion, and in mine as well, the goal really for us as far as practical theologians is to get people to have deliberate theology. And this is true of youth ministry, and it's true of pastoral ministry, really I think all kinds of ministry. It's certainly true of educational ministry. Now, this is how I teach, is that I am less interested in the specific answers that people come up with. I'm less interested in someone's theology at the end of the day being the same as mine. I'm not trying to clone myself. What I want is to take people from an intuitive or an embedded theology to a deliberate theology. I want them to have thought through issues. I want them to have critically examined things. And I want them to own their faith. So it's not just an inherited faith. It's something that they have actually examined and are confident in. And the only way you get there is by questioning. So I think this is an important chapter, because it really lays what I see as really kind of the big picture goal here. What we're trying to do, mature faith, is deliberate faith. And so that's always been my approach to youth ministry. And so I think it's a good thing that she started out with that. She goes on to talk about practical theology, which is simply practiced faith. We understand faith by doing it. A lot of times we think about practical theology as something that pastors do, but it's not. It's something that every Christian engages in practical theology, because it's simply lived out faith. It's lived out theology. And so she talks about that, and really the whole rest of this book is going to be about practical theology, which she sees as consisting of 4 tasks. It's for our understand the concrete situation. So this is contextual, right? What is going on in this specific instance, and how do we express a transcendent, eternal theology in this concrete situation? The other 3 steps are reflect, detect and evaluate, and project. So there's 4 parts to this book. Those are the 4 parts. So the first part here deals with understanding the concrete situation. So that brings us into chapter 2, which I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about, but this is on sort of the theory and the science of adolescence and child development. So a lot of behavioral science, a lot of psychology, dealing with the whole idea of a teenager is really a recent phenomenon. It's really a 20th century thing that we created this category called adolescence that was between childhood and adulthood. And so to treat that as a distinct life stage is only within the last 100 years or so. But also, it's a category, a time frame that has been expanding. We have the expansion of adolescence, especially over the last 30 or 40 years, where now people are entering adolescence earlier. It used to be, 13, 14. Now it's about 11 that they're entering adolescence, and especially they are exiting it much later. So it used to be, hey, you're 18, you're an adult. Now we have this whole category of young adult, which really is just late adolescence, and it can go well into your 20s. Because so many more people go into college now, that really extends the adolescence, because you're still a student, right? You're not out there on your own, so early and even mid 20s, and sometimes even late 20s. In a sense, people don't feel like they're an adult until they're 30. I'm 35, so I'm only 5 years into adulthood, I guess. But but it's not it's not the same for everyone. It varies. I got married very young. I got married when I was almost 21. I was just about a month away from being 21. So for me, I'd say I actually became an adult much earlier than most of my peers. But marriage is being delayed. People aren't getting married until they're in their 30s. They're not really settling down into a job. It's oftentimes not even moving out until their 30s. That's sort of the stereotype of the millennial. So this is an interesting chapter. I don't have a whole lot else to say about it, but just read through it. It's the science of adolescence. Got to understand your subject. The one important thing is that the whole idea of moving out of, or what adolescence really is defined by this process, what we call individuation. The process of kind of becoming your own person, developing your autonomy. So you're no longer attached to your parents. You are your own person. And it's just that's taking a lot longer now than it used to. So that's chapter 2. Chapter 3 is on theology and youth culture. This is a very practical chapter on how do we communicate and how do we contextualize the gospel for youth culture today. So the key here is language. The author of this chapter talks a lot about language being the link between our theology and our culture. That all of our evangelism, all of our teaching of theology, it's an interpreted theology. We don't just hand people beliefs. We have to interpret it for them. We have to. It's all coded, right? It's all communicated to us through human agents. So how do we communicate theology in and for a particular culture? And the idea of incarnation here is very important as well. That even the way God communicates to us is always through human culture. Think the Bible, right? It's a book, and in many ways not unlike other ancient literature. Speaks a lot of the same language. And yet, God could have telepathically communicated his, doctrines and divine truth to us each. He just could have implanted it in our minds instinctively, but he didn't. Instead, he chose to use human medium through history, through culture, through language, and then most poignantly in the incarnation of Jesus himself, God becoming a human. And so we kind of continue that humanness of our of evangelism today as well. So it's necessary to contextualize and construct our theology using the culture's tools available. So that's what youth ministry is trying to use youth culture to communicate the gospel to youth. Now, chapter 4. This, I think, is the real crux of this part of the book. And this is where our discussion is going to come from. It's the history of youth ministry, and it's very interesting. If you like history, I find this stuff interesting. Going all the way back into the late 1700s with really the origins of youth ministry. But throughout this history, picks up on two different approaches to youth ministry, or two different paradigms for it. What is the goal of youth ministry? What are we trying to do? And the two paradigms here are conversion and nurture. All right, so is youth ministry about youth evangelism? Are we trying to convert youth to become Christians, assuming that they're not Christians, and we're going to help them to become Christians? Or is it about youth education? We're assuming, hey, these people are being raised in the church. We're assuming they are Christians. We're just going to help them to become mature Christians. We're educating them. We're nurturing a faith that we already see there. Now, to some extent, it's not an either or, right? It's both and, right? There's certainly youth ministry does try to reach out to teens who are not Christians and help them to become Christians. But so we do that, but there are also circumstances where maybe we're not doing that so much. Maybe the focus is more on nurturing and raising up children in the church. And this is really a question that has been with the church for much longer than just youth ministry. You could go all the way back to the early church. And in the early church, right, even our theologies regarding baptism kind of touch on this issue. When does one become a Christian? Can you be raised as a Christian? Or does every person have to kind of make that decision for themselves? Or is it an individual thing, or is it a family? So you get into the baptismal theology, in the New Testament. We have no explicit account of children being baptized, but we do have these texts that refer to households. Someone is baptized and his whole household with him. And so the interpretive question there is, well, does that include children? When households are baptized, does that mean that a parent was able to speak for their children and have them baptized? And we just don't know what was going on in the earliest church because it's not explicitly described. We do know that fairly early on, by the mid-2nd century, it was becoming more common for people to be baptized as children. And certainly by the time we get to the Christianization of the Roman Empire, that is becoming the norm. And all the way into the medieval period, that sort of took over, and the expectation was that everyone living in a Christian empire was a Christian. And so you weren't out there converting so much as you were nurturing. But there have always been revivalistic impulses. Missionary religion, and then with the Protestant Reformation, some of that came under fire. So the Anabaptists in particular, redefining what it meant to be a Christian, and taking issue with the idea that one could inherit their faith, or one could be raised as a Christian. Instead said that no, each person sort of stands before God on their own, and so they stopped baptizing infants. And baptized only. That's where we have believers' baptism comes from that, right? Each person has to become a believer on their own. But you could, I think, apply that to youth ministry as well and say, well, is youth ministry for the sake of children who are already Christians, and our goal is to make sure they stay that way and to nurture them in the faith? Or are we out there trying to convert the lost and save the lost? Is it evangelism? And we've gone back and forth. So it talks about really the origins of youth ministry, the late 1700s, with Robert Raikes creating the Sunday school, so the Sunday school movement, as really an evangelism. It was to reach out to and reform poor, delinquent kids, and so the emphasis was on conversion. And we've seen this all throughout the evangelical tradition. So if we think evangelical Protestantism tends to emphasize conversionism. And so evangelical churches, their youth ministry tends to focus on evangelism and on conversion. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got Horace Bushnell, and this is in the mid-1800s. Bushnell represents liberal Protestantism. And he found that revivalism was very hard to maintain, right? It just sort of happens spontaneously. and revivalistic traditions are very hard to pass on from one generation to the next. And having come out of a revivalist tradition myself, I see that as the case. So he said the goal really ought to be to nurture kids so that they are never anything but Christian. We shouldn't need revival to create to have Christianity, because revival assumes that you need to be revived. Revival assumes that there's been a slumber, right? But he said, well, what if we just never get to that point? What if we never get to the point we need a revival? And so his emphasis was on nurture. Let's make sure we're raising let's make sure we're raising children in the faith so that they don't depart from it, so we nurture their faith. All right, so that's the liberal tradition has tended to emphasize nurture rather than conversion. Now here's where our question is going to come in. The discussion question this week is really, what do you see as the primary role of youth ministry? Conversion or nurture? So it's a very simple question, but I don't want just a pat 1 or 2 word answer. I want you to explain your view. I want you to defend your view. If you think, and it doesn't have to be 100% one or the other. I doubt that many of us would say the only goal of youth ministry is to convert, right? We're only interested in saving the lost. And if you're already a Christian, we have no use for you. Most of us are going to say, well, yeah, both of them are important. But what do you see as the essence? How do you strike that balance between the two? So I want you to explain your view. And I'm not looking for there's a lot of flexibility here. Take it in the direction you want. But I want you to reflect on this tension between nurture and conversion in youth ministry and talk about kind of what's your emphasis, or what do you think the emphasis ought to be on. You can also reflect on your own experience. Did you come out of a background? Did you feel like, if you grew up in a youth group, did you feel like it was about conversion, or was it about nurture, or was it both? What was the balance there? So that's the question for this week. The 5th chapter, which I don't have a whole lot to say about, is on including youth in the missionary work of the church. It's that youth really are the church now, and so they need to be included in the work of the church. So it deals a lot with different scenarios and different ways that youth can be actually active in the missional work of the church. It talks about St. Francis and the idea of the sacramental poor, really seeing that in encountering the poor and needy, we encounter Christ in them, sort of the Matthew 25 thing. To say that that's what youth missions needs to be. It's not focused on how it makes us feel. And often that's the way youth missions work. At the worst, they are nothing but a fun trip that happens to have a little bit of work thrown into them. More often, there's a lot of me focus, right? I went on this mission trip and, how it affected me. How I saw all this poverty and it made me feel more grateful for what I have. Or it made me feel guilty for what I have. But the focus is always on me. And the idea here is it needs to not be. We need to focus youth missions on actually encountering Christ in the people we're serving, and actually seeking to change the world. And hey, we had a good example of that this past weekend with the March for Our Lives. All these high school students out there marching, dealing with gun control and school shootings. And regardless of what your view on that issue is, I think that's a good example of the type of thing that we could see here, where youth are actually taking the lead in trying to change the world. So that's that chapter. But again, I think chapter 4 here, and to some extent chapter 1, the two most important chapters here. And so I'll leave you to that reading and the discussion question.